Director of the Butler University Center for Faith and Vocation. Welcome to the seminar on religion and world civilization, religion, peacemaking, and conflict. We're heartened by your continued support of the series. We're now in our 16th year, and you've been able to make this possible. As this is the final session of this year's series, I would like to offer some special words of thanks to Butler University President Bobby Fong for his support of the seminar on religion and for the Center for Faith and Vocation, and he just stepped out of the room. So he's taking a call. Suzanne, you'll report this to him, right? When he came to Butler 10 years ago, this series was a part of a generous grant from Lilly Endowment. Dr. Paul Valliere had been making some successful grant proposals to the Lilly Endowment, and we were sustained for several years with that generosity. But today, the series is a funded initiative of the university and a fixture of the curricular commitment to liberal education that includes exploration of religion and of global perspectives. As President Fong prepares to leave Butler to lead Ursinus College in Pennsylvania later this year, the Butler Seminar is truly a part of his legacy in our community, and we thank you, President Bobby Fong. I'll give you the overview later. Now it's my pleasure to bring to the lectern the moderator of the 2010-2011 series, Assistant Professor of Religion at Butler, Dr. Chad Bauman.
Good evening, and thank you to Judith, and let me add to the Center for Faith and Vocations, welcome one again from the religion program at Butler University. Those of you who have been here through the other seminars of our year know that this is the fourth and final in our series on religion, peacemaking, and conflict. And we've been blessed by a range of thoughtful speakers and also by large animated crowds. So thanks to all of you for that, particularly those of you who were here for earlier sessions. And let me also add my personal thanks, now that they're both in the room, to President Bobby and Suzanne Fong, who have been, as Judith mentioned, long-term and important supporters of the Center for Faith and Vocation and of this seminar series, and we've appreciated that. As always, we'll run an efficient program in this evening in order to preserve as much of the second hour as possible for audience participation. Our keynote speaker will speak for no more than 35 to 40 minutes, and then each of our respondents will speak for 10. And I'll be keeping everyone moving along, as the Presbyterians say, decently and in order. Our first speaker for the evening is Dr. Katherine Marshall. Dr. Marshall has received degrees from Wellesley and Princeton and has worked for over 3 decades on international development, which focus on issues facing the world's poorest countries. She's a senior fellow at Georgetown's Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs and visiting professor in the government department. She is also a senior advisor for the World Bank. Dr. Marshall has been closely engaged in the creation and development of the World Faith Development Dialogue and is its executive director. She serves on the boards of several NGOs and advisory groups, including Avena Americas, the Nuano Peace Prize International Selection Committee, and the Opus Prize Foundation. She is a board member of the International Development Ethics Association and sits on the International Anti-Corruption Advisory Conference Advisory Council. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She served as a core group member of the Council of 100, an initiative of the World Economic Forum to advance understanding between the Islamic world and the West, and was a trustee of Princeton University from 2003 to 2009. She speaks and publishes widely on issues for international development. She's also author of dozens of books, articles, and opinion pieces, and now works blogs and writes editorial pieces regularly. The most pertinent of her books to this evening's topic, perhaps, are Faith and Good Governance Towards Strengthening Global Coalitions, which was published in 2009. The World Bank From Reconstruction to Development to Equity, which was published in 2008. And Development and Faith, Where Mind, Heart, and Soul Work Together, and that was published in 2007. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marshall to the podium.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here, and I look forward especially to the exchange that we will have when we have finished speaking. Now, let me make sure that I've got this right. Okay. To tell you what I'm planning to do this evening, first I'm going to start with some stories that come from my experience, and to try to draw some lessons from those stories. I'm then going to talk about the development business, which is the business that I've worked on actually for close to 4 decades, and ask a question in light of the series here, how development is related to peace and how it's related to religion. I'm then going to focus on some of the frameworks that we have to help us in what are some of the world's most complex and demanding ethical challenges, and give you my sense of what I view as a hierarchy of reasons why we should care, because that is, in a sense, the fundamental message that I hope that I will leave with you. If I have time, and the timekeeper will be very strict, I would like to talk about some of the complexities of bringing religion into public policy, and particularly into the international development world. I have something of a unique experience of that because I was drafted by the president of the World Bank, Jim Wolfenson, and the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, George Carey, to work on an initiative which they thought would be really a no-brainer, relatively easy, but it turned out to be one of the most controversial issues of Wolfenson's tenure, and we learned a great deal from the ensuing discussion. And finally, I'd like to finish with some comments about what I think it means and where we go next. So first, I want to give a few caveats. People talk about religion. In fact, that's sort of the topic of this series, religion. But we should never underestimate the complexity of religion. It's hardly surprising, given that it's thousands of years of history and something that's immensely important to perhaps 6 billion of the world's 7 billion people. Anything, I think, that lumps all religious beliefs or religious traditions into any kind of a basket, I think that's asking for trouble. More specifically, the terminology is fraught, and every word you can use is contested, whether it's religion or faith, spirituality, secular. People have debates about all of them. Just to give you one illustration, we have come to use the term faith-inspired organizations rather than faith-based. And that shift came after a specific set of discussions in the Muslim world. And as one example, the Aga Khan Development Network, which is a very important actor in this field, is very uncomfortable with faith-based, but accepts faith-inspired. And that is actually true of a lot of organizations in different parts of the world. But we had, in fact, called this organization the World Faiths Development Dialogue, on the understanding that faiths was more acceptable to a broader range of traditions than religion, because particularly the Vedic traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism and so forth. And I was in a big meeting at the UN, and a Buddhist nun stood up and said, "We don't like the word faith, we don't have faith." Basically, you can't win. But you should be very conscious of the fact that these words are loaded. And so be careful, just be careful. Even when you listen to me, I sometimes take things for granted. We should also remember that ethics and values are intertwined in these debates. These are not matters of engineering. These are matters of the human spirit and the human soul. And they are the essence of the ethical challenges we face as a human condition. I think I'm going to preface this with one comment from my admired former boss, Jim Wolfenson, who said several times, "We cede the ethical high ground to no one," meaning that we do not, in the non-religious world, accept that religious institutions have any kind of an ethical monopoly. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. But coming from the development world, what I can say is that many religious people and many religious scholars, but also day-to-day people who think about their faith, have an easier time articulating the ethical dimensions. They're more comfortable with it because for many of them it's their business. So the questions of ethics are complicated, and of course there are many who believe that their ethical tradition is the correct one. Religion and culture, where does one end and the other begin? That's something that comes up all the time in these discussions. And I want to highlight that development, perhaps 25 or 30 years ago, was a fairly simple term. We all knew what it was about. The development institutions, international development, we had a fairly good idea what it was going to be, what the path was. But it has become an immensely complex, also contested world. As we've, for example, worked in Cambodia, and there's some illustrative documents just for you to browse through on the back table, we found that people wanted to know what we meant by religion, but they also wanted to know what we meant by development. And there really is no topic that's not part of the development agenda these days, whether it's climate change or trafficking or road construction or maternal mortality or you name it. They're all part of the equation. I have two underlying questions that I'm addressing. The first one is, what's religion got to do with it? And I'll come back as to why that is such an important question. But more fundamentally, the question is, what might a deeper appreciation of religion's role and a more active common engagement offer in terms of better policies and programs for development, especially in the hotspots of the world? In the hotspot, Haiti, Somalia, some of the more difficult countries. So what can we learn? How can we do better as a world community if we take religion more into account? So now to my stories. I have 4 stories. The first one, many years ago, I was the country director for Mauritania. Mauritania was at that point facing actually quite serious conflicts. It had Tuareg refugees in Mauritania. It had Mauritanian refugees in Senegal. The government didn't much want to talk about it, but it all centered on the area in the south, the Senegal River Valley, in the tensions between Senegal and Mauritania. So I was the country director. We were facing a big international meeting where issues of human rights, refugees, conflict were all going to be on the table. So I was visiting this valley where there were so many of these tensions. And I was in the car for a couple of hours going from Nouakchott, which is the capital, down to the valley, with the Minister of Agriculture. He was newly appointed. He had previously been a military officer. And he did not want to be in the car with this woman. He didn't know what he was in for. So I was trying to make conversation. So agriculture, so I started asking him about camels, because camels are very important in Mauritania, and I think he knew every camel by name. He probably owned a large number of them. So we talked about the camel trade and moving to Libya and moving to other parts, and the hoofs and camel milk and you name it. So then I asked him about cattle. He knew less about cattle. He wasn't as interested. And then we went on to sheep and goats. He really was not very interested in chickens and so on. So finally we came to a village. And everywhere I looked in that village, this is in the valley, as in many villages in Africa, there were donkeys doing everything. There were donkeys who were carrying firewood, carrying children, moving house, carrying food, thatch, everything. So I said to him, well, what about donkeys? And he answered, on n'a pas d'âne. We don't have any donkeys. So I was surprised, and I looked around. I said, well, what are these? And he said, ça n'a pas d'importance. It's not important. So what conclusions do I draw from this? The first one, and this is a lesson, and one thing that has never ceased to surprise me in looking at religion in relation to the development process, is blind spots. That people literally do not see what is in front of their faces. Now in this case, this was was a man who came from a desert tradition for whom the traditions of the Arab parts of Mauritania were what was important. The South, the black groups who lived in the valley were really not important. Small-scale agriculture was not important. And so the life of a village, its donkeys, were simply not important to him. So I think that that was one of the messages. That was not the way he saw poverty. When he was talking about poverty, he simply didn't see it. So the question was the frame of reference that you have and the need to be aware of it. Just recently, I asked a very distinguished academic about something that I'm involved in these days, which is some meetings around the United Nations on the possibility of a decade of interreligious dialogue. And I happened to ask this scholar of the United Nations system whether he'd heard anything about this, and was this something that was worthwhile engaging in any way. And his answer was, well, I heard something about that a few years ago and I didn't think much of it. So he said, I think my radar screen is turned off on that topic. So this question of what you see and how you see it, I think, is one of the important themes. Second story, Madagascar. Now, this was one of my very first challenges when I was working for the World Bank. And there was a project in the middle west of Madagascar, a place called Tsironmandide, which was a classic horrible project. It was a project where some very smart technicians looked at this area of Madagascar, which seemed to be completely empty, nobody there, and they said, what we need to do is to have Texan-style ranching here, and we'll bring in some Texans. And they forgot that the French had been there for a very long time, and it was probably one of the most disastrous projects ever. They imported Brahman bulls who all died. The Brahman bulls refused to have anything to do with the zebu cattle, so there was no breeding. The calves died, but they also tried to fence this area, and they forgot that in Madagascar, stealing cattle is a proof of manhood. It's a traditional sport, so that people simply came and stole all the cattle. And at one point, the butchers from the capital actually came and they slaughtered the cattle on the spot, took the meat back to the capital to sell, and left the ears on the barbed wire as sort of their calling card. So I was actually there. We were trying to do some damage control because, in fact, Madagascar was at that point going through a revolution. And one of the revolutions that was going on was that whereas the previous government was quite happy to hand out land concessions, the new government recognized traditional rights. And so all of a sudden everything was in an upheaval, and we were trying to do a project in a different part of the country that was based on villages and consultation and all the good things that we do. I think the point that I'm trying to draw from this is that the old-fashioned projects, which I think are still people's image of what development is about, were a very long time ago. This was 1974. And one of my concerns in discussions about development is that very often we're fighting yesterday's battles. Another thing that you could not come out of this experience without being aware of is that weak institutions and a weak state and a revolution is no way to have development. So I think that's a second point. And there was also a lot of raw corruption. A third story, I worked on Rwanda. Anyone who worked on Rwanda, I think, has injuries to their souls. I was working on Rwanda before the genocide, but there had been a genocide before. And I'm showing this picture for those of you who could see it because it's such a beautiful country. The green rolling hills, small Switzerland of Africa. It was almost unimaginable what happened there with the genocide. And it's something that everyone who's been involved in Rwanda has to say, what could we have done that would have made it different? What was striking also, though, was that there was rational policy, polite dialogue, there were successes in development, but it was all deceptive because there were poisonous relationships behind the civility. And one of the things that I remember was one project we were working on in the area called Mutara, where there was a very Belgian-inspired project to divide the land into orderly ranches. And when I went there, I heard that the bishop had cursed the World Bank and the United Nations, and I think I should have paid more attention to that at the time. Fourth story is much more recent. One of the things that everyone is looking for in the interfaith world, particularly, is success stories. Interfaith is a very positive direction, because the idea is that by different religious groups and different religions working together, they get to know each other, and when there are problems and crises, they are able to find each other and therefore to solve their problems in a peaceful way. So we've looked, and people are doing surveys in various places saying, what are the examples of success? And at a couple of meetings that the Berkley Center and WFDD organized, we kept hearing about remarkable successes in Aceh. You may remember this picture here is of Aceh and the tsunami, after the tsunami. Absolute devastation that happened there. I can't remember the numbers of people who died, but it was hundreds of thousands. And Aceh had been at war, and one of the few good things that happened as a result of the tsunami was that it propelled people towards peace. And what people kept talking about was the remarkable cooperation between improbable groups. So Muhammadiyah, which is a huge Muslim Indonesian organization, was working with World Vision, was working with Muslim Aid, with the Salvation Army, with the Catholic Relief Services. There was an extraordinary amount of cooperation. And after some initial tensions around orphans and the group that was accused of taking orphans and saying they would raise them as Christians in this very, very Muslim country and very Muslim community, the groups worked out codes of conduct and managed to work together. And there's no question that Aceh today is much better off than it was before the tsunami and during the war. So in that sense, it is a remarkable success. The only qualification that I want to raise in this is that one of my colleagues, who I sent a draft note about the Aceh example, said basically, what have your people been smoking? And what he was saying is that there were two very negative things that happened in the course of this remarkable success. The first was that the big organizations basically drew off the most skilled people from the local communities. And the second was that it undermined the role of moderates in the local communities, so that it, in fact, may have contributed to a growth of extremism in the area. So why do I raise this? My message is that these are very complicated issues, that I don't think that that's the whole story. I think that the positive story is by far the most important. But the unintended consequences in this case were obviously quite significant. And they were ones that many of the people who had spent years working in Aceh had not seen, because that's not what they were looking for. So in a sense, it comes back to my camels and donkeys. So to turn quickly now to the development business. Some of you, I hope, are interested in going into the development business. So how does it work? How is it linked to work for peace? Just to give you a very quick sketch, the development business is very much a post-World War II phenomenon, so relatively recent. It began as Reconstruction and with humanitarian instincts that dominated in the early years. And that is a continuing theme with new worries. The new worries are coming particularly with the disruptions of climate change, that we have a whole set of new conflicts, conflicts over water, conflicts over resources coming up. The early focus, and the kind of thing that the Madagascar Cattle Project was about, was focused on infrastructure and on rapid modernization. But there's been really a profound change. And this is a point I want to make because I think it's part of my argument that we should not be fighting yesterday's battles as we talk about the development challenges. So there's been a tremendous new focus on rural development, on the growth of cities, which are now the majority of the world's population lives in cities, and in a whole range of new and complex problems. There was a focus for a long time, way back to the early 70s, on trying to make sure that development served the lowest 40% of people, and that's changed into a much more complex focus on poverty. The World Bank has a sign as you come in the front door: "Our dream is a world free of poverty." I actually said this once, and in a talk I was talking about my conviction that ending poverty is possible, and my 8-year-old son, who was listening, said to me, "Do you really believe that?" And I said, "Yes, I'm absolutely convinced." But it's a much bigger challenge, and I'll come back to that in a second. Much more focus on gender issues, on indigenous peoples, and some of the themes that are very live today and that in fact link these issues that we're talking about, peace, religion, and development, is an awareness that nothing works if the communities concerned don't support it and don't understand it and don't do more than support it, don't actually commit themselves to achieving it. So consultation, participation, and empowerment are the words of the day. Development is in part about money, and you hear a lot about the resource transfers, but it's much more about ideas, and it is above all about inspiration. So the contemporary picture is of a set of institutions that's very complex, very dynamic. There are very elaborate institutional arrangements, and there's a great deal of contention about what works and what doesn't. So this is far from simple. One thing that is exciting is that there are many disciplines. Sometimes people think that development belongs to the economists. That is not true. It's the educators, the sociologists, the engineers, the environmentalists, and everyone else. We are focusing more and more on results and on monitoring and evaluation to try to make sure that we are always asking what it is we're trying to achieve and whether it's working. Governance, in other words, the how do you do things and how honestly, are key issues. There's a new focus, and in fact, after the Second World War II, it was reasonable to divide the world into rich countries and poor countries. And people still talk about North and South. In fact, people sometimes still talk about the third world, though I suspect that most students here have forgotten what the second world is, because it's a long time since there was a second world. But in fact, the world today is very different. You do not have rich countries and poor countries. In fact, that's one of yesterday's battles. That changed a long time ago. Nor do you have the world divided into North and South, in other words, sort of the rich countries and the poor countries. Much more complicated than that. But there is an important new focus, and it's one that to me is critically important for the topic we're talking about today. And it's a focus on what you might call the bottom billion, in other words, the poorest billion people in the world, the fragile states. The World Bank has an awful acronym, which is LICUS, low-income countries under stress, somewhere between 25 and 50 countries. But these are the countries that are trapped at the bottom. They're trapped in conflict, they're trapped in poverty, they're trapped in corruption. And I would challenge you to name a single one of those countries where religion is not an important factor. And yet in the public policy discussions about the fragile states, about the bottom, religion is almost entirely absent from the discussion. So where does religion come into it? For many years, I said the institutions, the United Nations institutions, World Food Program, the FAO, UNICEF, World Bank, IMF, all started roughly in the period after World War II. And for at least 50 years, they had very little contact in any structured way with the world of religion. I did a search of the World Bank's 2,000-page history of its first 50 years, And there's one reference to religion in the index, which is a 1962 Catholic Bishops' Conference. As someone described it, it was initially ships passing in the night, really beyond periodic contacts, very little systematic understanding. And then we had a period when there were tensions that grew and obvious communication gaps. Some of you may remember Jubilee 2000, the campaign around the millennium against, that focused on poor country debt. Huge demonstrations, Seattle. Meetings that were held of international organizations had chain link fences for blocks around, demonstrators at the door. It was from this period of tensions that this World Faiths Development Dialogue that I mentioned was born, because Jim Wolfenson at the time thought that there was something fundamentally wrong with the worlds of religion and development fighting each other and trading and barbs and insults, because both of them cared about poverty, that was their mandate and their mission. And so this small organization and initiative was born. And it's explored a lot of very practical issues. One of my comments is that it's looked at one time or another at everything from AIDS to zebras. So right now, what's on my plate this week, very interesting study on women, religion, and peace. We're doing a report on water and religion. We're focusing on maternal mortality. There's a lot of tension around issues of orphans, genetically modified organisms, a lot of tension around that. And the Gates Foundation, which is looking at agriculture in Africa, has asked us to look at what religion might have to do with agriculture. So those are just a few of what's actually in my inbox this week. But I think the point is that this is a minefield, and it's proved to be far more contentious than we'd ever expected. So what does this all have to do with peace? The former Pope made a comment that development is the new name for peace. And what does he mean? First of all, there's an obvious one, which is that conflict destroys development. I would say that Madagascar now, which has been in conflict since 1974, when I was first there, is poorer today than it was at the time that the cattle ranching project was born, and that it is conflict and corruption that have done it. We should also remember that development, whatever else it means modernization and it means change. And change is conflicted. Change is disruptive of traditions. So conflict and modernization come together, and there is need for a much more purposeful reflection on how those links work. Religion is clearly a part of conflict. It's a part of development. It's a part of change. And it's also a part of building a just and lasting peace. You heard recently from Scott Appleby, who every time that we are in a discussion insists on calling it peace building. I suspect he said that here, because his comment is that you don't make peace, that you build peace, because it's a permanent, continuing process. So development is about hope, equity, and human potential. And that's how these three issues are so inseparable that it's almost impossible to unravel the different links. To give you some practical illustrations of issues that involve conflict and faith these days, again, these are things that are immediately in my inbox, that I'm talking about constantly. Great concern about extractive industries, mineral, which often deals with land, rights to land, and it also deals with the rights of indigenous peoples, who are sometimes the most marginal and the poor. Interestingly, there are groups of Catholic bishops who are organizing and mobilizing to try to address at a systematic, at a global level, some of these issues around extractive industries. We are always looking and often see the prophetic voice. This is the seeing beyond the immediate into the future, speaking truth to power, and looking to the traditions of religions to speak about those issues, to issues like corruption. There's an interesting initiative that a group called the Elders is working on. This is Jimmy Carter, Mary Robinson, Desmond Tutu, Graça Machel, Nelson Mandela. And their initiative is to bring religion into an effort to end child marriage. And the idea, which I think is a wonderful idea, is that after all, it's religious leaders who marry people. So who is better placed to try to bring this practice to an end? Last week we had some inspirational stories about what faith communities are doing in the United States to welcome migrants and to help migrants to be integrated. It was the more heartening because of the bitter and fractious debates in the United States about immigration reform, and it was nice to have a message of hope. They're wonderful peacemakers. Two that I work with are the former Bishop of Oslo, Gunnar Stalset, who at the age of 78 travels all around the world to Timor-Leste, Guatemala, Sri Lanka, Bosnia, basically trying to mediate, using both his faith tradition and his personal charisma. And just yesterday, the Nuwano Peace Prize for this year was announced, and the winner is a remarkable Thai Buddhist called Sulak Sivaraksa, who has been working for peace in many parts of the Far East for decades. Swami Agnivesh is an iconoclastic Indian leader who is negotiating now with the Maoists and negotiating in Kashmir. So the personal role of these people is extraordinary. What's also extraordinary about all three of these people is that for them, religion and peace are the same issue. And they do not see solutions to the conflicts they're working on unless you deal with the root causes. But you also, and let's be clear, we have to recognize that religion is part of the problem and part of the solution, that it's a combustible commodity, but one with huge potential to do good. To give you some quick arguments, how much time do I have? Just okay. I want to make a very simple argument, but I think that it's one that's very important. Poverty today is a scandal. The fact that children die who could be saved easily, that children are not in school, that people do not have jobs. It's a scandal, but why is it a scandal? If you look in the Bible, it says the poor shall always be with us. And the historical reality is that most people were poor. Most of Europe was malnourished a century and a half ago. Most people, the majority of people in Europe. But today, we have a dramatically different situation, because today we have the resources and the knowledge and the example of ending poverty. There are countries in the world that have transformed themselves in a generation. And with that capacity comes a new moral responsibility. And the new moral responsibility is to achieve the end of poverty in our lifetimes. I'm going to skip this and basically go through what I see as 5 related but overlapping reasons why I hope that everyone here cares. The first and most complicated argument for ending poverty, and this is as true in the United States and in this community as it is in the world, is that ending poverty is basically about social justice. And the language that's used for this in many settings is a rights-based approach. The idea is, at its simplest level, that every child has a right to go to school, that your fate should not be determined by where you're born. It should not be determined by luck, that there should be, is one of the analogies, which is, I think, somewhat unfortunate, a level playing field. The rights-based approach addresses some of the pitfalls of charity. Some of the pitfalls of charity are that it can be erratic. You know, I give charity because I feel like it. It's the end of the year, it's the end of December. I give charity out of the goodness of my heart. Those have some pitfalls to it. But I think that what the rights-based approach involves is a common responsibility at a global, and at a national, at a community, and even at a family level to do something about the inequalities and the unfairness of the world. A very brief story, I was in Niger many years ago, and there were 22% of Niger's children at the time in school. We visited a school in the capital city, one of the better schools, where there were 160 children in the class sitting on the floor. Now, clearly that's a recipe for disaster. What was even more tragic, by the way, was that there were $500 million committed to education, but there were tensions within the country, political factors that were preventing that from being used. But I came home, and the next week I went to visit a preschool where my son was going to go, where there were 14 children in the class, where there were debates about whether computers should be used for 3-year-olds. There were books, there was light. And you have to ask, what is the fairness and the justice in the opportunities for those children? So I think this first argument, to me, the top of the ladder, is that this is basically an argument of fairness and justice. And the world is a very unfair place. The cartoon at the left is a Noah's Ark, and it's an old Oliphant cartoon, and unfortunately the caption reads, "Who let the Americans on board?" The second argument is that caring and compassion matter. This is the ancient justification for charity. It's the ancient justification for caring, for social solidarity, and it's as valid today as it was then. Notwithstanding some of the pitfalls that I mentioned. So we should never lose the importance of charity and of caring, but I think we need to be much more conscious than we have been of some of the dangers that go with an approach which is purely voluntary and which can, by its nature, be erratic. I was at Ethiopia. I was in a wonderful charity that was helping with AIDS victims in Ethiopia. And they had a very large whiteboard in one corner, and they had at the top their sources of funding and the year. And what you could see was that donors were enthusiastic for a period of time, and then they sort of wanted to go on to something else. And so this group was constantly looking for new sources of revenue, and they never knew how they were going to pay their staff, and they never knew how they were going to pay the stipends for the children who they were supporting, because their financing was so uncertain. It's very easy, and this is one of the journalist challenges that we face. This is a very rare headline, and in fact, this would be called development pornography today, because it's putting a tragic image onto a child. But 20,000 to 30,000 children die every day. That's the appeal to caring and to charity, but it's also the appeal to anger, because why don't we hear more about the people who die? The third argument that's made is an important one. It's an exciting new area. It's entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, bottom of the pyramid. It's the argument, basically, that by helping poor people, by microcredit, by jobs, by everything else, to purchase, to enter the market, it's in everyone's interests. And of course, there's a huge amount of validity in that argument. What are people asking for in the Middle East? They're asking for jobs. They're asking for the chance to earn their own living. But I think we need always to be a little bit cautious that there are many who are concerned as to whether shopping in markets is fully the answer. And this cartoon, which you probably can't see, is an image of Western culture invading the rest of the world with dollars, Mickey Mouse, beer, and weapons. The fourth argument why we should care, I remember Bob McNamara making this argument many years ago. If we don't help people in Mexico, we'll be helping them in the United States. The argument about movements of people and markets. It's an interconnected world, and we cannot build walls. So the question is, how do we do that? And the fifth argument is that if we do not address the issues of poverty today in our world, we will see violence. It's a complicated argument because we know that poor people are not terrorists, and terrorists are very rarely poor people. But we do know that the poorest areas are vulnerable and they are volatile, and that building walls around ourselves, building walls around the United States, is not a viable long-term solution. And failed states and communities harbor a very strong sense of injustice. I'm going to skip, I think, the section, but just, anyone who wants these slides afterwards, let me show you these two. I mentioned that the issue of involving religion in development has been and remains very controversial. And there basically are 3 Ds and an E as to why so many countries. Jim Wolfenson was always proud of saying that it was 192 countries to 0 favoring a systematic approach to religion. And basically the 3 Ds and the E are, first, that religion is seen as divisive and political, that they fight each other, that religion and state should be separated. The second is a widely held view that religion is against development, and there are no issues that are more significant than gender rights and reproductive health. That those are issues that color every other discussion of any other topic. The third is the still widely held view that with modernization, religion becomes less important, that it is basically defunct. And my final comment is an observation that's very similar to the way people used to deal with gender, which is that when people start talking about religion, I'm talking about engineers, health specialists, smart people. They tend to be emotional, and they tend to put it in their own terms, in terms of their own experience. And so it's been very difficult to have a coherent discussion. With gender, what changed the picture was evidence. Evidence, for example, that the benefits of girls' education even included increased in the head size of children because of better nutrition. So we need that kind of evidence. So we need research, we need your thought on these issues. Very briefly, the religious side is just as skeptical about the development world. They see it as an extension of American power, the empire, the multilateral national companies. They see an economic ideology, the drive of the markets. They see a lack of ethics, a lack of the discussion of ethics. They see an enigma of organizations they don't understand, and the bottom line is that it is dangerous. So there are answers to every one of these, and many areas for action and reflection. And I'm just going to end, because I think I'm out of time, I'm not going to revisit my stories, but I am going to revisit the image that I showed at the beginning. In some talks, I give away a prize. I don't have a prize with me, but does anyone know what this is? Actually, it's shown on the screen, so it's not fair. But this is a Hoberman sphere. And the basic message, it's a toy, an absolutely wonderful toy that expands. But the basic message that I think we should never forget in thinking about these issues of religion, of peace, and of development is the interconnectedness, that these are issues that matter to each and one of us, every one of us. And they are, to me, the single most important challenge for our time. So as you hear that the first target for budget cuts is international development assistance, I think it's worth some careful thought, because if we do not address the inequalities and the unfairness in our world, it's very hard to imagine a safe and a secure and a just world for our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. Our second speaker is Dr. Jay Howard. Dr. Howard earned a BA in sociology from Indiana University, South Bend, and an MA and PhD in sociology from the University of Notre Dame. He's completing his first year as professor of sociology and as dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Butler University, right here in Indianapolis, which I don't need to tell you. Previously, he served as interim vice chancellor and dean, assistant dean for budget and planning, head of the Division of Liberal Arts, and professor of sociology at Indiana University, Purdue University in Columbus. Dr. Howard's research interests range from the scholarship of teaching and learning to religion and popular culture. His book, co-authored with John Streck, Apostles of Rock, The Splintered World of Contemporary Christian Music, was published in 1999 and named in 2000 as a Choice Magazine Outstanding Academic title. Along with author Nancy Greenwood of Indiana University, Kokomo, his forthcoming book, First Contacts, Teaching and Learning in Introductory Sociology, is scheduled for publication by Rowman and Littlefield later this year. Dr. Howard served as deputy editor of the American Sociological Association journal, Teaching Sociology. He's a fellow of the PA-MAC Center at Indiana University for Inquiry on Teaching and Learning, and he served as the 2006-2007 president of the North Central Sociological Association and as an elected member of the Bartholomew Consolidated School Corporation Board of Trustees from 2004 to 2010. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Howard.
Well, I want to begin by pointing out what Chad did not say. He did not point out that I don't work in development and that I'm not a theologian. I'm just a sociologist. So what am I doing here, right? What have I got to say about any of this? Well, that's a good question and is a good challenge. I'd like to thank Dr. Marshall for her very insightful comments and inspiring comments to challenge us all to think about what is the role of faith? What does religion have to do with this? And I'm going to try to address her a couple of key questions with just a few thoughts that are based both on my thinking as a sociologist and my experience of one growing up in a Christian faith-based tradition. I grew up as a evangelical, and as an adult, my own faith tradition has evolved more toward the Mennonite peace and justice orientation. So that's kind of where I'm coming from today. So Katherine asked the question, what's religion got to do with it? And she told us the fascinating story about the agricultural minister in Africa who had blind spots about donkeys. I would suggest, as a sociologist and a person of faith, that we have our own blind spots, that we fail to see what those of you who share that same faith tradition calls us to. If we stop and look at how often are certain topics addressed in the Bible, and if you grew up in an evangelical tradition, you know, the Bible is very important, right? We try to take it very seriously. Well, there are over 2,000 verses in the Bible about Christians' obligation to care for the poor and widows and orphans and strangers and sojourners in the land. And the Old Testament prophets tend to condemn the Israelites for neglecting the poor. I mean, when was the last time you heard a sermon on one of those topics at your church, right? We tend to wear our own blinders and sometimes miss the call, perhaps, in our own faith tradition to be responsive to the kinds of issues that Katherine is setting before us today. Katherine also mentioned the passage in the Bible where Jesus says, the poor are always with you, which is one of those topics that often comes up when you try to talk about involvement in addressing poverty and development on a worldwide issue within Christian kinds of circles. But it's interesting, while that story, that statement is in the story of a woman who anoints Jesus' feet with expensive perfume. It shows up in all 4 of the Gospels. And in 3 of the 4, the woman is condemned for wasting a year's wages to anoint Jesus in this way. And then he replies, "The poor you always have with you, but you will not always have me with you." But what's interesting is Jesus is quoting from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 15, where, again, the Israelites are told that if you are obedient, you won't have the poor in the land. But because you're not obedient, the poor will always be with you. So it's fascinating that we take that statement out of context and often use it, well, there's our excuse. We don't have to care about the rest of the world because Jesus told us the poor are always going to be with us. But he's really quoting a passage in the book of Deuteronomy that says you ought not to have the poor with you, but because you don't do what you're supposed to do, they're going to be with you. So it's a different sort of message if we dig into it a little bit deeper. As a sociologist who also teaches social theory, you can't avoid Karl Marx. You've got to talk about Marx in social theory classes. And what did Marx say about religion? Famous quote. Anybody? The opiate of the people, right? Religion is the drug of the people that sort of numbs people into inaction. And there have been times and places in history where he was right, that religion was used as a way of sort of pacifying people to accept the status quo and not try to change things. But there are also a large number of instances throughout history where we can find religion is sort of the amphetamine of the people, where it challenges people to step up and act and to address injustices in the world. You can find it in relatively contemporary kinds of movements like the Solidarity movement in Poland, the People's Movement in the Philippines, even our own U.S. civil rights movement being inspired by faith-based actors. Also, we run into the secularization thesis, which Catherine alluded to, the commonly held perspective that religion is defunct, that it's going to dry up and go away in our modernizing science-based society. But instead, sociologists who study the impact of religion in society find that religion is actually quite strong and very vibrant in society. So religion is a tool, a resource, a motivation for people that can be tapped to address issues of poverty around the world. And a good bit of Catherine's work has addressed the topic of partnering religious organizations or faith-inspired. You have me really worried about the terminology I'm using here tonight. So faith-inspired organizations partnering with NGOs or governmental agencies and working to bring aid to issues of poverty and development around the world. But I would also suggest there's also the opportunity for faith-inspired organizations in the West, in wealthier countries, to partner with faith-inspired organizations in the developing world and work directly with them. And I want to kind of give you a case study real briefly of an organization that my wife and I have been very involved with called Compassion International. Compassion is a Christian, faith-based child development organization that tries to look holistically at the needs of the child, both spiritual, social, economic, all kinds of development aspects there. But they are openly faith-based, and they partner with faith-based, faith-inspired organizations in other countries, and rather than sending expensive American or Western staff, they send the resources to those other countries and let the native populations operate those kinds of organizations. So they typically partner with churches in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in South America, and provide the resources so that kids can get medical attention, so that children can have a decent set of clothes. In essence, inspires people of faith to partner with both an organization but also a single child, to sponsor a child in another country. And I've had the very privileged opportunity to go and meet some of the children that my family and I have sponsored in Ethiopia and Rwanda. Rwanda post-genocide. And you're right, Rwanda is a very beautiful country, and it's hard to imagine the kind of evil that took place there in such an idyllic setting. But what I found, say, traveling in Ethiopia, was looking at the crowds of children, because everywhere you went with a busload of white people, you'd get these swarms of kids coming out and say, look at the white people, look at the Americans. And you could look at the crowds and tell which ones were in these compassion-based projects. The kids had decent clothes. They were basically healthy. They looked nourished. They had enough to eat. And you could see children beside them wearing rags that you wouldn't use to wash your car. My roommate on that trip happened to be a physician, and he started pointing out to me, you could identify which kids were sponsored and which weren't because of the number of eye infections. That there was an area we were in with a huge number of eye infections, and you could see kind of the pussy, swelling eyes in kids. But when we go to the compassion projects, you wouldn't see that. And so in addition to the idea of faith-inspired organizations working with the more values-inspired, shall we say, non-government organizations or government agencies, I think there's also a role to be played for faith-inspired organizations in the West and the developed world to partner with faith-inspired organizations in the developing world. And I see my time is up, so I'll stop there.
Thanks to Dr. Howard. Our final speaker for the evening is Jim Morris. Jim Morris is in his 4th year with Pacers Sport and Entertainment, and in his 3rd as the franchise's president. Morris joined Pacers Sports and Entertainment in 2007 as a special advisor to then CEO and president Donnie Walsh, and was named president on April 16, 2008. A graduate of Indiana University with a master's degree from our own Butler University, Morris has spent much of his life in Indianapolis in a variety of key positions. He served under former Mayor Richard Lugar as chief of staff. He then went on to Lilly Endowment, serving as its president from 1984 to 88, and from 1989 to 2002. He was the chairman and chief executive officer for IWC Resources Corporation and Indianapolis Water Company. Before joining Pacers Sports and Entertainment, Morris was the executive director for 5 years for the United Nations World Food Program, where he oversaw the world's largest humanitarian agency. That rewarding position took him to many oppressed parts of the world as he worked on behalf of the hungry poor, particularly children. And I still have a few more things to say about you. See, now I'm getting the treatment I've been giving the speakers. He's also served on numerous boards and committees, including as chairman of the Indiana University Board of Trustees, treasurer of the United States Olympic Committee, and a member of the Board of Governors of the American Red Cross. So please join me in welcoming.
My colleague apologized for just being a professor of sociology. I'm just the president of a basketball team. But there's a real lesson in how I justified the value in becoming president of a basketball team. But that's for another lecture. When I went to the World Food Program, it was a very unusual set of circumstances. I was probably as ill-prepared to take on an assignment like this as anybody that ever came along. There had been someone selected to do the job, and the president asked me to be the United States ambassador to the World Food Program, FAO, and EFAD. EFAD is a mini version of the World Bank dealing with agricultural development issues. And he asked if I would like to do this. I had actually hoped to be, when they first raised the issue, my choices were to run the Peace Corps or to run UNICEF. But those positions, UNICEF was not available. and the Peace Corps had been promised to someone earlier in the year. So he said, would you like to do this? And I said, I only want to do something useful and helpful. And I went through the 2 weeks of ambassador training. You do this with your spouse. And on the Friday afternoon of my graduation from ambassador training, I was summoned to the 7th floor of the State Department and said, would you like to run the World Food Program? I repeated myself. I said, yes, I would. Well, I said I would only like to do something useful, and I wasn't looking for something honorific. I wanted to make my time count for something. So through an odd set of political circumstances, my name was put forward to run the World Food Program. Most of my Indianapolis friends still think I was the U.S. ambassador to the World Food Program. I get lots of Christmas cards addressed to Ambassador Jim Morris. I open them and enjoy them, but don't feel guilty about doing that. I don't think I should. But anyway, this opportunity, remarkable. I had a career with the Lilly Endowment, a career with Dick Lugar, a career in business. Always felt that I tried to be a decent person. I cared about those that were the most vulnerable, especially children. And I learned to have a great, as I often say, I left Indianapolis to do the job as a moderate Republican, one of 12 left in the world, but and I came back a radical feminist. My views of the world were changed dramatically, but so I head off to the World Food Program, and there truly would not have been there would have been no one there that would have ever heard of me. As we would say in Indiana, they wouldn't know me from a load of hay. And but my biography was somewhere on the internet, and it was noticed that I had been a trustee of the Christian Theological Seminary. And my soon-to-be WFP colleagues immediately concluded that, having served as a trustee of CTS, that I was some far right-wing religious fanatic coming out of this far right-wing religious tradition of CTS. We know how absurd that is, but so when Jackie and I arrived in Rome, I arrived to this extraordinary agency of remarkable people who were concerned that suddenly their agency was going to be led by this, I guess, aggressive Christian. And it took me a while to work through that issue. I am a Christian, strong belief, but I learned, and I have always believed, that you do not need to be a Christian or a person of faith to be effective in making a contribution, the difference in the lives of people who are vulnerable, at risk, lonely, whatever the way of defining it might be. But I found my rationale for doing what I did, and the struggle with dealing with the issues that I had to deal with produced a much more intense focus in my own life on my own faith. And I've been gone now 4 years from the World Food Program, so I'm not as on top of these issues as I once was. But I must say to you that the intensity of my being perplexed about this panorama of humanitarian distress and sadness, my faith comes into play all the time. The World Food Program, largest humanitarian agency in the world, would have fed between 100 and 115 million people in 85 countries each of the years I was there. 30 years ago, 80% of our budget would have been defined as development, 20% relief. Today, it's just the opposite. It's 80% in responding to crises and violence and natural disasters around the world. A remarkable shift in what the agency was about. Catherine's notion of a billion people in poverty in the world, the bottom billion, as she called it, half of them are children. And as I was there these 5 years, I became consumed with this issue of 500 million children in the world, hungry, many of them poorly educated, if at all, sad, lonely. I could talk about this forever. And it's wrong, it's reprehensible, it's sad, unacceptable. The United Nations has said, with its statement of Millennium Development Goals, supported by every member state voting aye, has said by 2015 we're going to cut hunger and poverty in half. We're going to address gender equity, infant mortality, maternal health, HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria. We're going to see that there is universal primary education for every child in the world. And the more I thought about these issues, the more I was convinced that with the development mentality, the argument is, why are you worried about these issues? Is it for a moral reason? Is it an economic reason? Is it a political reason? Is it a security reason? For me, the moral imperative was enough. Now, I understood the rest of the arguments, and they were valid. But if there is anything wrong, either in our community of Indianapolis or anywhere in the world, that today, and I like Catherine's affirmation that we can address these issues and do it in a very large way. It's a very tough issue, at the point in your life where you begin to wonder, can I make any difference? Can we really get at this issue of poverty or hunger? And you begin to say, well, probably not, maybe only incrementally. It's a very sad day for a person to begin to think that way. But I became, the World Bank reports would tell you that the most important economic investment any country in the world can make in its future is in the good nutrition of children 0 to 2, to see that they're also born to healthy mothers. If that happens, the child has a chance. The World Health Organization would tell you that hunger is the single greatest health issue in the world. I was chairman of the UN board of UNAIDS, and if you went to a village with terrifying, sad issues related to HIV, the first thing they would ask for is water and food. Because all the antiretroviral medicine in the world doesn't make any difference if the body is so worn down that the medicine can't work. But I became consumed with the notion of child hunger, and that the most powerful investment, highly leveraged that the world could make in addressing the Millennium Development Goals was to see that, that the children were no longer hungry, that every child in the world was fed. And I knew the power. You feed the little girl in Malawi, make it possible for her to go to school even for 5 years. Everything about her life changes powerfully for the better. I spent tons of time in Japan and Germany with folks who said after World War II, the single most important investment that the United States made in the rebuilding of those countries were seeing that their children were fed. George McGovern, my friend, it's amazing the kind Katherine talked about different people finding common ground. I started off in this job wondering what kind of a person George McGovern was, and I ended the job loving the man. But he often quotes I could really go on for quite some time. He quotes a dean at the University of Georgia that says, the single most important economic investment the United States of America has ever made in the southeastern part of our country is in the school lunch program. The hungry child has no chance to learn, to think, good health, to grow and develop, but feeding a child can turn the child's life around. My faith teaches me that the life of a child is a sacred gift from God. But I'm interested in solving this problem. And I like it when people's motivation is the same as mine. But if they're concerned about this panorama of issues, and whether they come at it from the same perspective I do, it doesn't almost make much difference to me. And I can find enormous common ground with our Muslim friends, with our Jewish friends. All of the great religions talk about the sacred gift of the life of a child, about the responsibility we have for each other, and about the notion of giving and sharing. You know, here in Indianapolis, we've brought all the faith communities together to address this issue. And you know, maybe I should talk while I walk to the, but at the World Food Program, we had 3,500 partners. We did not distribute food except in North Korea, a horrible, horrible situation, through government. We used private partners. Half of them were faith-based, half of them were secular, to use my primitive vocabulary. But, you know, but so often, when we had an issue, we would turn to faith-based, you know, turn to faith-based people. Just because you knew that they likely were going to be there with you. So, those are my comments. Dr. Fong, you're wonderful, and you married a wonderful lady, and you've been a great blessing to us in this community. The other day I was giving a speech to a Rotary Club, and I was about done, and there was a man in the back of the room that got up and started to walk out. And I said, "Sir, excuse me, I'm just about finished." And I said, where are you going? He said, "Well, I'm going to get a haircut." And I said, "Well, why didn't you get the haircut before I started speaking?" He said, "I didn't need a haircut before you started speaking."
And I'll never need a haircut, I don't think so.